of the
Okay, I want to welcome. This is a great day for this channel with Bold Like a Leopard. We have on a person who's been on the Gad Sad channel, a person who has, I believe you've also talked to Jordan Peterson, Dr. Rick Mehta from the University of Acadia, formerly, and we're going to talk about that as well today. But Dr. Mehta, welcome to the channel. I appreciate you coming on to, of course, a smaller YouTube creator.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here. I haven't been on Jordan Peters' channels, and so that's a dream.
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly I had some critiques of some of the things I noticed in his book concerning especially child discipline, but, a lot of his talks are pretty engrossing. So let's get to really the issues that are kind of swallowing the world today in terms of free speech. So you, of course, come from academia, but beyond that, who is Rick Mehta? How did you come to be a psychology professor over at the University of Acadia? And what in your background drove you to go into that field?
Well, my undergraduate was in neuroscience, and I found that I just liked the idea of looking at the biological basis of behavior. So, what is in the brain that drives us? So, for my master's was in psychopharmacology, just trying to study how it is that drugs affect the brain. From there, I switched over to animal and human cognition, and did that for my postdoc and for the first few years at Acadia, and then eventually switched into more applied research, though just pertaining to decision making, just because I thought that would be a bit more accessible to students who wanted to work with me.
So in general, do you think like the academia was that kind of an avenue for you to reach a wider audience while helping people through, the field of psychology, which is, of course, in order to resolve a number of underlying, emotional issues that people have?
Well, the problem that I had is I just never had the high grades to get into clinical psychology. So, yeah, my undergraduate GPA was a 3.5. So, using the University of Toronto scale, the GPA system there goes up to 4.3. So I'd be halfway between a B plus and an A minus. So respectable grades, but not really the A plus grades that are expected if you wanted to get into clinical psychology. So I was fortunate that I was able to get into experimental psychology and complete a PhD, and that someone gave me a chance after grad school so I could get more on the research experience, because that was the one thing holding me back from getting an academic job, was just not having enough of a publication record. But yeah, my passion was actually in the teaching side more than the research. So the research I did because I had to, but the teaching I did because I really wanted to, and that's what really drove me.
Okay, and 1 second, I'm trying to resolve this camera issue that we're having, but it doesn't seem to be working. But so of course we wouldn't be talking today, obviously, if it wasn't for an issue that came about due to the climate on college campuses today, which is not just, I went to a state college here. Thanks for your honesty about your grades. I also was kind of a middle of the pack student. I was an engineering student not too long ago. In fact, I just graduated 3 years ago with my master's. But of course, I personally, as an engineering student, we were somewhat shielded from this climate of increasingly politicized academics. However, even on my campus, you could probably notice that there were more announcements and more groups that were dedicated to identity politics. How is it that it came to be that you, and if I'm correctly gauging it, you're not exactly the most conservative, doctrinaire person, came to be sort of this target of, I'd say, scrutiny from the social justice and multicultural establishment?
Well, I think it started, my problem started back in 2015 with my career, but where I noticed, I think, the noticeable change at my institution came when we had our candidates come to visit our university for the position of president. And so back then, President Ricketts, as part of his presentation, has said that he wanted to commit the university to social justice, and no one else blinked an eye, but it really struck at me. And so that's when I first started getting worried that maybe when the university is committing itself to a political ideology, that would have implications for free speech. So until then, I thought that what I was seeing on the videos was just a problem at other campuses and had nothing to do with our campus. So that's when I first started becoming concerned, and that's what made me hold a panel discussion, which is the first video I posted on my channel, and then a talk that I gave on free speech. So I just thought, oh, these problems are happening at other universities. I would present the research on that I've done. We'd have a discussion, and that reason would prevail. And yeah, I was proven wrong.
Right, and I could appreciate it too, your position, because I grew up in the 1990s, the era of, Marilyn Manson and a lot of really edgy music, especially. I think in music it was most pronounced. My favorite band was Korn, and at the time it was people from the political right that were talking about censoring things that were either blasphemous or simply obscene and tasteless. Comedy. Certainly there was calls to censor South Park, especially. So it really and ultimately none of those campaigns really survived, because it kind of became what's nowadays called the Streisand effect, where you see, people are told not to look at something and they, it just piques their curiosity. So nowadays it seems to have shifted more to the political left, although I do see people who are censorship friendly on the right as well. Why would you say that it was so unnoticeable for the earlier part of your career, or did you see signs of it at the time as well?
I think there were signs. It was just very subtle. I think everything was happening behind the scenes, closed door meetings. So that's why I know I was very grateful when Lindsay Shepard's story became such a big item, because finally, like, there was someone who had the foresight to record it, and then when it was released, and then a lot of other people were saying, yeah, that's a good reflection of the kinds of meetings or the kinds of things that have happened to me. So otherwise, yeah, when it's a closed door meeting and you don't have proof, what do you do? Because you can't accuse your colleague or someone else without evidence. So it makes it a bit awkward. But yeah, so I think that's how it's happening. But to give you a concrete example, though, of how I thought there were problems and it was subtle, was there was a speaker, famous lawyer here, Marie Henin, and she's famous for defending a guy named Gian Gomeshi, who is I guess a talk show host with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And then he was let go over various sexual allegations, and she was a lawyer who had defended him. So anyway, she was giving a talk at Bishop's University, and it was being live streamed at Acadia. So the ads that were sent out, or the posters, so they're on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, but the title of the talk was only about this small. And then I noticed that it was being introduced by our vice president academic. And then after the talk, there was going to be a discussion, and the discussion was by the coordinator of the Women and Gender Studies program, a colleague from my department who's a proponent of the Women in Science and Engineering Acadia group, and one philosopher who tends to leans towards the left, and I think identifies as a feminist. So that struck me as very odd at the time. So they were saying, yeah, we are allowing it, but however, given the nature of this person's work, we need to put it into context. And so that seemed strange at the time, and now I can kind of look back in hindsight and say, oh yeah, I see what the purpose was of that message, trying to play it both ways, where they say, yeah, we support academic freedom and free speech, however, it needs to be balanced with, leftist perspectives.
Right, and I think that really is the issue that has compelled a lot of people to disassociate from the left. I myself, I come from, I'm from the U.S. My parents were, they were immigrants from Israel, but they were both dedicated. My dad's still alive. God, thank God. But they're both pretty liberal, democratic voters, loyal, but they're more blue collar democratic people. So can you we'll get back to your specific case, but do you think that there is this disconnect between people who are, nominally for, the left in terms of class struggle and in terms of this multiculturalism and what some are calling cultural Marxism, and the actual working class people of countries like yours, Canada, and of course, I live in Ohio. We have a very large working class population. Do you think that there is like a lack of cultural connection between those two populations?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely, no relationship at all now between the leftists on campus who claim to speak for various groups and the actual groups themselves. So actually, that's what made me speak out in the first place. Wasn't due to any high-minded issues. It was that my union was going into contract negotiations. The negotiations had fallen apart, and my union wanted to have support for a strike motion, and I was opposed to it because one of the reasons was that our union was asking for these wage increases, and I didn't feel right about doing that when other employee groups on campus had experienced pay cuts in the past. So we were getting a loan forgiveness, and my position was that the first people who that money should go to are our support staff, because they took cuts in the past and they really need the raises to bring their money up to modern, inflation rates and whatnot.
Right, and I actually, I'm personally, I went to a college that's a little less of what do you call it, an ivory tower, because it's an urban campus. It's a state school. It's barely above the rank of a community college, but certainly there are people who have told me who have worked as adjunct faculty even, and they say that, and one of them that I know who did so at the University of Wisconsin, which is it's a pretty hallowed academic institution here in the U.S. He said that adjunct faculty is modern day slavery, and I've thought that he's kind of exaggerating. Do you think that there is an issue, though, that now that there is, in some colleges, a permanent class of tenure, that you have them delegating a lot of their work to these, these adjunct faculty people that do most of the work?
Well, that's a separate issue from the free speech issue, but definitely, I think the reliance on part-timers is, it is definitely appalling, because they're just from contract to contract, and the way the union likes to frame it is, that their employment depends on whether the administration will give them a renewal, etc. But they also have to fear from their colleagues too. So you have two groups of people that you're trying to make happy. And you could be the best teacher in the world, but if there's one complaint that's in your course evaluations, and you're not friends with the right people, you can be sure that that one complaint will be used against you.
Okay, so back to your own case. So I'm looking at Inside Higher Ed, which reported on your dismissal in September 2018. And it says, Acadia University in Canada fired Rick Mehta, Associate Professor of Psychology, following an investigation into comments he made on social media and in the classroom, CBC News reported. Mehta said that multiculturalism is a scam. Is it Meta or Mehta, by the way? I don't want to...
Meta, yes.
Oh, Meta.
Silent H, yeah.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no.
So that there is no wage gap between men and women, and that Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission has created a victim narrative regarding those who attended Indian residential schools. So exactly how is it that it was discovered that you'd made those comments on social media? And then do you think that, so the comments in the classroom, were they reported by the student body or by the faculty?
Probably some mix, because it's strange. Like, I was given a letter saying, we're investigating you based on X complaints, but I never saw physical copies of those complaints. It was just a weird process. So the way it works, the way they do it in Canada is, once they decide they want to get rid of you, then they try to find some kind of pretext where they could find something that'll stick. So try to make your working life really miserable in the hopes that you'll say or do something stupid, and that so-called stupid act is then what's used as the basis for your dismissal. So those are the things that definitely would have set, people off within the university, and then they would have decided, oh, can we find some kind of a pretext to use to, get rid of him.
So you're saying it's almost like it was in that, I remember when I was reading the Treasure Island when I was a kid, and one of the opening scenes was when one of the people, I think it was like Billy Black, was in the saloon, and somebody comes in and gives him the black spot, and we're on to you and all that. They've basically decided that you're going to be a target for a future a future roster of recriminations. Is that kind of how it went down? Like they were looking for the right thing to get after you for?
Oh, definitely. And the proof of that actually is in the minutes of the Acadia Student Union meeting, of all places. So I just came across that by accident on the internet just in March. And so that was from the previous March. And so there you can see the student union president saying, okay, there's an investigation being done, which was by Wayne McKay. And then the vice president academic for our student union then says, oh yeah, but there's also this second investigation that's also being completed under the collective agreement. And so the collective agreement, that's an agreement between the admin and the union. And so that was, I think, March 13th, that was in the minutes of that meeting. I wasn't informed of that second investigation until I think it was May 17th. And then I didn't even know that the report actually had been completed until my union tried to get me to sign a non-disclosure agreement where I would have pretty much just allowed the university to discipline me on flimsy grounds to begin with, and then also agreed to not talk to anyone because one of the clauses was a gag order. So yeah, so I didn't sign it. And then the way the union rules work actually is the union could just go ahead with that decision without sign that contract without my permission, and that's considered a valid contract in Canadian labor law.
All right, so you basically were of the mind by that point that you knew that they were basically, they'd had the finger on you, and so by this point they'd already contracted the services of this Dr. McKay.
Yep.
And has he been used kind of on an ad hoc basis against other academics in the past, either at Acadia or at comparable institutions in Canada?
Well, in terms of what he has done, there was at the Dalhousie Dentistry School, some guys had formed a Facebook group, and they'd made some arguably nasty comments about some of their colleagues in their dental school program. So, how they wanted to have say violent sexual contact with some of them, and that became public. And so, yeah, Wayne McKay was the investigator on that.
So because of indecent sexual fantasies.
Yeah, I mean, they said they wanted to hate F someone.
Okay.
Like those kind of comments. And yeah, so he was the one who investigated that. Although if you look at the CBC pieces about that, and especially the comments, most reasonable people could see that that was just, that he was the hired gun for that. He'd also he played a role in getting some anti-bullying legislation passed in Nova Scotia, and that legislation ended up being overturned because it went against basic due process for anyone who is, accused of cyberbullying. More recently, I think he's played a role in tightening our drinking and driving laws, where the police can come after you well after, I think, most people would expect alcohol to even be in your system.
Okay, so essentially he was brought on as your personal inquisitor, or was he going to have like a more permanent role at the college?
I don't think it was a permanent role. He was there specifically hired. Yeah, he was there for the specific purpose of investigating me. But there was nothing in there to suggest that it was in any way a fair investigation. He's asking leading questions. He's allowing people to make their submissions anonymously, and what you see in the report is just their name blacked out, and they don't have to sign, but their testimony can still be used against me. He didn't even ask like basic what normal people would consider regular kind of follow-up questions. So, like, if one person's claiming that people are afraid of me in the department, they have panic buttons, and he doesn't even have a response like, "Oh, really? Why would that be? Didn't you didn't you try something else?" That seems rather unusual. So, those kind of typical responses were not even there. For the two students who were supportive of me, I noticed that he seemed to be drilling them a lot harder than he did the other students who were against me.
And apologies if you've already said this, but were you permitted either representation by your academic union, or were you allowed to bring your own personal counsel to these hearings?
No, so basically the only representation I had was through the union, where the union's lawyer made it very explicit that his client is the union, not me.
Mm-hmm.
So, my position there was just as a member, was more as an afterthought. So, and I did put in a complaint afterwards, before I got dismissed formally. I put in a complaint to the labor board under the name of the law is duty of fair representation. And their response is that, well, union executives have full control over a member's case. And when they make their decisions, it's based on what they think is in the overall interests of the membership. So my own, so my individuality didn't matter at all.
Right, and I think that there's something I can relate to there, because my dad used to be a union official, and I'm personally, I'm kind of a pretty economically right-wing person. I've never supported unions, but at a certain point, I believe a few years ago, at the place of his work, which shall not be named, they did lay off a number of people, and like the union was going to. The union members were saying, well, are we going to defend their positions and the union was like, nope, cancel their membership. So I was like saying to my dad at the time, like, what's the point of these unions if basically they literally cave all the time, and but not to digress too much. So essentially, how long was this process whereby you were being essentially grilled by this outside counsel, and then how did that interfere with your work? Were you allowed to continue with your work instructing students at Acadia?
Oh yeah, I could definitely go on using it. I was able to finish my courses, but it was, I guess I was kind of, I was with the understanding though that everything I was saying or doing was being watched, and they're going to try to find something to nab on me.
Right. So you were essentially you were on pins and needles at every juncture when you were and you're a psychology professor, so obviously you're probably assessing the situation in terms of how what you say will be perceived by the crowd, or by perhaps somebody enters the room by like for example, there are students that come in to observe a class. So were you like waiting for additional complaints to be filed with these disciplinary boards?
Well, all I knew is that was that well, based on the one or two the one complaint that I actually did get to see, what I noticed with that one student was she had sent an email to multiple people. And that's not typically what you would observe. So the couple times I did see complaints, I noticed that there would be an email sent not just to me, but there'd be a whole bunch of other people copied on that. And I'd never experienced anything like that before. So of course, what I'm trying to do is answer that question without actually accusing anyone of anything.
So the adversarial process of a court, as we know it, and I mean, we're both from countries that practice English common law, but typically a defendant would be allowed to face his or her accuser. Was that never afforded to you during this process?
Not before. So before that would have to wait until we went to arbitration.
Mm-hmm.
So which is the hearing after you get dismissed.
So they can collect all of this dirt on you, and then only later do you get to sort of have your day to reply. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So what I found interesting about this whole past year in the process, was the letter that I was given in on February 2017 by our vice president academic, and there it said very explicitly, during the course of the investigation, the university will be sensitive to issues such as due process. And then I was told by my union's lawyer what that sentence meant was that after I was dismissed, then I'd be given due process when there's a hearing and the people in the report testify. So yeah, it does not go at all the way anyone would normally read that sentence.
So obviously, of course, we saw the article earlier. I'll show it on the screen again, whereby you were dismissed from Acadia. You have said that matter has been settled, but we can't go into that. Do you think that effectively your career in academia has been, cut short permanently? I mean, I see the market in academia is not exactly encouraging, even for, the profession I'm in. So what are your feelings on that?
Yeah, well, in terms of what I can say about anything in the past, so not the settlement itself, but basically, in terms of what's in the internet, is the letter that was given to me by the vice president academic that was on August 3rd. So the key point is we did have a meeting to discuss the contents of that letter. That was a 4.5-hour meeting. And in that one, I maintained my composure the entire time. So I found it interesting was that the vice president's an academic. She's the one who holds all the cards and the power to threaten to dismiss me. But it was her and the dean, two of the three members on the panel who had to meet with, who were the ones losing their composure throughout the meeting. So, yes, remember the vice president academic, she was the one who wanted to take a break partway through. I was the one refuting some of, the statements she was making. And so she was the one who kept, losing her composure, as did the dean, especially when there was a part where they said, I talked to you informally to discuss this issue, however you continued. And I said, oh, I have no record of that meeting having occurred. However, I have this email from you where you said explicitly that you were not asking me to take down a Facebook post. So that meeting, it was a 4.5-hour meeting. They lost composure multiple times throughout it. And then a couple of hours later, I was told I was going to be dismissed. That was a recommendation being made to the president. So with the president's letter, what's important is that he doesn't actually refer to anything specific. And his is the letter that matters, because he's the only one who actually has the authority to dismiss me as a tenured prof. So the vice president academic can't do that. Only the president can. And he couldn't refer to anything specific. So instead, he just said, the details are in someone else's letter and someone else's reports.
All right, and you actually just answered a question from Larry Gerke, one of our viewers, and his wife Cher, who is I believe she's a K-12 instructor, but she was asking if you were tenured, and the answer is yes. And I believe in Dr. Sad's chat with you, he mentioned that the purpose of tenure is not in order that people may rest on their laurels as academics. It's in order that they at least have some shield from, I guess, assaults like what you're going under. If I can use the word assault, that's like the word that comes to my mind. So you personally have, you've paid the price in your career. If I may, can we switch track and talk a little bit more about the broader climate in academia, as well as, how that's translating into our modern politics? So. Yes. I personally, I kind of ran away from the world of political commentary for, I wanted to be an engineer because I didn't really feel that there was a good way to get my views across. And then eventually there was an incident that happened at the University of Virginia about, I would say 5 years ago, if you've heard of it, the rape on campus story from Rolling Stone. And I started to realize that the climate of academia, which feeds into the media, feeds into corporate America and the corporate world at large, has created a climate where, people do not have individual rights anymore. They seem to have collective identities and, the attendant social stigmas attached to them. So, of course, several such incidents have occurred since then. The mattress girl controversy. I don't know if you've heard about that
Oh,
at
yeah.
Columbia. So, given that, have you personally had to counsel students who fear that they may be falsely accused of a crime, whether sexual or otherwise, due to their identity or due to a score settling by another member of the student body?
Um, that happened where some students reached out to me during my last year, where they just said, I'm on a sports team. So when they were talking to lockers, they would just say, I don't even know what to say around my girlfriend because I'm not sure if I'm going to say something that's going to be offensive, or I don't know what I'm going to say in my classroom that'll be that'll be held against me. So that there is, yeah, a lot of that is happening now on our campuses. Yeah, and that seemed to be, from emails of support that I got from others. People would sometimes reach out to me saying, this is a problem I'm seeing in the college system, and what should I do?
Yeah, and I think like if I mean, speaking from personal experience, if this were to be applied to real life, I mean, the stuff that I've said on social media, just from kind of getting into troll fights with people, I would probably get the electric chair of social media justice. It would be like trial would be over in an hour, because I think a lot of people use, especially the internet, in order to sort of, I would say, blow off steam, from their own personal frustrations, or from, work stress, maybe even stress from school. If you're talking about people who are, even in K to 12 education, there's children who, they're absolutely ticked off from what they're doing at school. So they go home and they do gaming and they say all sorts of ridiculous things online to a person halfway around the world. And yet that's being policed, especially concerning, children who, who are playing games, and they're now trying to say that video games are culturally insensitive. They're trying to say the same thing about comic books, about cinema, about, I don't see it so much in music yet, but I could be wrong. Like you yourself, I mean, you work in the field of psychology. Would you say that when like noticing those trends has influenced your decision to object to this, this attitude?
Well, there's definitely something wrong with the Canadian academic scene for sure. The first time I guess I started to suspect something might be wrong actually was during the Jordan Peterson's scandal, when he was speaking out, because at that time I was expecting that our department head might be doing something, because with the department head, she was not only just department head, she was also the president of our union. And so I thought, oh, well, here's a fellow colleague in psychology. I'll speak out in favor of him, or from the side of, oh, well, he's a fellow academic who's unionized. Let's stand in solidarity with one of our unionized brothers. And then there was none of that at any of our meetings, either the union or during the department meetings. And then when you see everyone else also being silent, at first I thought, is there just something wrong with me? And that's what made me start to, want to start to doing some digging and looking at what's on YouTube and starting to figure out what is actually going on.
Right, and of course, now, I mean, I don't want this to be like explicitly political podcast, because obviously I don't think that your story should be confined to the world of politics. But you live in Canada. Most Americans know that your prime minister is Justin Trudeau.
Yep.
And Mr. Trudeau has championed a lot of the values that concern, limiting freedom of speech as his administration's priorities. There's, what is it, Bill C-16, was it?
That was the one that Jordan Peterson specifically was protesting. Yeah.
Right, and there was another one concerning, I believe, Islamophobia,
Yeah, yeah.
and he himself has paraded around the world. He's gone. I have a friend, and my friend Adrian, of course. So we have a mutual friend from India who laughed and laughed and laughed at Mr. Trudeau's visit to India and claimed that it might be the most ridiculous thing he ever saw. So Trudeau has of course, I think he's well-meaning, but the whole well-meaning thing is I believe the problem, because he seems to believe that just talking about empowering women, talking about reaching out to the Sikh community, which got him into a ton of hot water over there in India because he happened to have an actual terrorist with him, or I believe he was like a attempted assassin. So that type of stuff, his well-meaningness and his attempts to reach out to impoverished minorities or minorities that have been historically disadvantaged, has landed him in a lot of hot water. Do you think that his election changed things at Acadia for you, changed it for the environment there?
Oh, I think so. Like I noticed some, yeah, just the change in the atmosphere almost right after the election. So after his big decision where he made 50% of his cabinet women just for the sake of, and justified it by saying because it's 2015, I thought for sure the next day we'd be talking in the lunchroom about what a stupid comment that was. But instead it was quite the opposite. And, I saw people on campus writing that on their doors or having that as signatures on their emails. So quite the opposite. Yeah, and I remember our department head too, because she was also union president. And first, it seemed strange that an MP, our minister of parliament, was going to meet with her. It just seemed like, why would someone from a member of the government be meeting with a department head? It seemed a bit strange. Or with someone who's president of a union. It doesn't make much sense.
Right, right, and I think like for us Americans, I personally, when we had an election a year later, I kind of wanted somebody, and I had like real issues that I wanted to deal with when we had an election. I guess over there in Canada it's a different atmosphere, but we have Obamacare and everything. But everybody was basically obsessed with the Trump phenomenon, and then it's sort of gone supernova since he's been elected. Is there that type of focus on Mr. Trudeau? I mean, there's this Jody Wilson-Raybould scandal that's been going on, and it's almost as if he's taken a machine gun to his entire. I don't know if you can say machine gun on YouTube anymore, but he's destroyed his whole feminist cred because he basically fired two of his ministers and expelled them from the party. They both happen to be women. One of them is the child of an indigenous leader. How does that make? How is that observed over in Nova Scotia, where you are? Is it kind of a surreal feeling?
Well, I haven't talked to. I don't know what average or typical people are looking at here. I know this side of the country tends to be vote a bit more towards the liberal or leftist side, and I think that's probably playing a role in why our area tends to be a bit more economically depressed. If you're voting for a welfare state and looking for handouts, by definition, you can't be one of the drivers of the economy. And so I think they're continual voting for governments like that support, giving up the handouts is contributing to our undoing over here. But in terms of the Trudeau, I think what I find interesting is that he was trying to speak for groups who didn't ask for him to speak on their behalf in the first place. So when it comes to issues like gender equality, this probably is about as good as it's going to get. As long as people have free choices, they're going to go into whatever career they feel comfortable with and doing what they like doing. And yeah, just men and women are different in terms of what they value, and that affects the careers they'll pursue and therefore the kind of money. So to try to pander then to small groups of activists when there's no real justification for the actions being performed will, I think, eventually fold on itself.
Right, and I think that we're seeing, I personally, I wouldn't say that I'm one of these objectivists that believes in absolutely no state structure, but observing what's happened in my state, Ohio, given the amount of, I'm taxed basically like, like somebody from Sherwood Forest or something, and personally in this county, and then 2 counties over, people are basically happy as clams, and nobody's complaining about, oh, we are lacking social services. Most people seem to be able to adjust, and there's a lot of things out there to compensate in terms of most social services. But the issue that I think really confuses me about Mr. Trudeau is that, let's go back to, I'm assuming that you're of Indian descent, correct?
Yeah, my parents came here from India.
Right, and most of the Indian community, especially in North America, seem to be people who are able to excel in academia, excel in I work in the medical devices industry, and we have a lot of people from India as well as the Far East, but India, Pakistan, all over South Asia. I don't know about Iran, but in places I've worked at before. So, what's like his deal? Those people seem to be accommodating themselves very well to the atmosphere in Canada. Why is there even a need to pander to them?
Yeah, no, I don't. I never understood that. So because most of the immigrants from India that come here usually end up succeeding. So we don't really need the help. And I know just my own mother, she came here, and through educating herself, she managed to work her way from being, someone who worked as a clerk at any company to getting into computer programming, and worked her way to becoming a senior systems analyst. So you're talking someone who's going into the field of STEM as a woman, and who's a minority, and she managed to make it just fine. So that's why I kind of make me bewildered when I look at the various women's group and what they're complaining about.
Right, and I think unfortunately we're seeing, there is this politicization of minority issues, and now I don't know if you are up on the news of today concerning our House hearings on white supremacy, and have you heard of what happened at I think it was the Judiciary Committee today here in the U.S.?
Wasn't following the news today, but what happened?
So essentially, they decided because Facebook and Google have banned white nationalism on Facebook, they had a panel of experts, and it was basically obsessing over. And granted, I know some people who are white nationalists, and some of the things they say are pretty troubling, to put it lightly. But the fact is that they made it seem as if America is being swept by this massive tide of Huns, like they said back in World War I and World War II, that we're basically being invaded by white nationalists because of the internet, and there needs to be more regulation. And then they characterize one of the witnesses, Candace Owens, who I've criticized on this channel, and a lot of my fellow YouTubers criticize, but they basically categorized her as a white nationalist herself, notwithstanding the fact that she's black, notwithstanding the comment itself was a critique of nationalism, of ethnic nationalism. So do you think now that the U.S. is being infected at the state level by the same sort of issues that you have seen affect your career as well as the politics of your country?
Yeah, I'd say that is something we're seeing in all of the nations in the Western world right now. So we're seeing the same kind of things happening in, Australia as an example, or Sweden, England. So it's not unique to Canada and the U.S.
So we have. I'm just going to read a couple comments here. I don't know if they're questions for you, but for example, we have Di Freighter Watcher. She says, I don't mind free speech, but given the current YouTube climate, I would say don't be a dumbass and put somebody's channel in the gulag. So what she's essentially saying is something that, I basically, because of copyright strikes I've had, when I put music on, I have to go look for covers, the song that was at the beginning was not by Rush. It was by a fine lass who was covering Rush. She was, so I have to do that. So do you think that people that besides yourself, obviously you're in academia and you've been basically hit over the head by this process, but do you think people that you know in your personal life also are policing their own speech due to this climate?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think just it's either that or you lose your job, right? So I mean, if that's what they could do to a tenured professor, is override the rules so they could get rid of me, and then try to some hoping that I would participate in my own burial. Then yeah, you can imagine what they're doing to others who are far less powerful. Because I thought that as a tenured prof, I wasn't expecting anything to happen to me.
Okay, and we have a question from Just My Stupid Opinion, and he's asking, why do you think that African and Middle East immigrants have such a hard time succeeding and integrating?
Well, it could be from some of that research that they found that could be due partially to biology, but then also we look at problems within various cultures. So it could be a cultural issue, because I know even there've been black critics who've criticized the black community in terms of what kind of music they're listening to. It's not that they're just listening to the music, but actually taking on some of the values that you see in some of the music that they're listening to. And some of that, I think, just comes from when you've repeatedly voted, for the welfare state, and you're used to having a community that's had generation upon generation of relying on handouts. So I think all those things are affecting the culture there.
Yeah, I mean, I can actually speak to what Just My Stupid Opinion was asking as well. We do have a lot of immigrants here from West Africa that seem to be doing okay, I guess. They typically finish their degrees and everything, but I personally, I had a neighbor when I was in middle school, or no, and when it was in high school, who was from Nigeria, and I happened to live in like a very small, but it was an entirely black neighborhood. I was basically the whitest person there, and he was just basically influenced such that he couldn't a day didn't go by when the cops weren't at his house. So this guy later straightened himself out, and I think he's like got a kid and everything. But yeah, I'd say that this culture of embracing the lack of success is really the I mean, look, I think that everybody has the right to follow their ambitions here, as long as obviously they don't want to. You don't want to have people like nuke the country, but as long as people can follow their ambitions and help the people around them, I think that it shouldn't matter what your background is. But I continue to see this sort of attitude among certain communities, and even in new communities, is being embraced.
Yeah, well, I think there should be the expectation that if you're coming into the country, that you are going to somehow try to integrate and fit in and contribute. And if you haven't in a set period of time, that they are sent back. I think, yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that. Because I think communities generally will be welcoming of new incoming people and will do what they can to help. But yeah, they also have to do their part as well too.
Right, and I think I guess another question I would ask: the higher ed article referred to comments you had made regarding multiculturalism, and such topics are also included in this other phenomenon that people are talking about, called cultural Marxism in academia. So when I was growing up, especially in schools, we did have a lot of diversity education. Especially, I remember in second grade, I had to do a book report on this director, Gordon Parks, who he created all those blaxploitation films in the 70s,
Yeah.
like Shaft. And
Oh, yeah.
I loved it, but it was like, why is a second grader going to do a book report for Black History Month on a guy who made films about basically this cop who had sex with a lot of women because he happened to be black? But so do you think that multiculturalism, I think, is tearing the country apart, because it is holding people to believe not in a unifying culture, but in no culture, basically in a culture of nullifying what it isn't as opposed to what it is. What do you think is the issue of multiculturalism, if at all?
Well, the whole premise is based on not just tolerating differences, but actually celebrating differences. And that's something I've even heard our mayor of a town of Willful say at a on Canada Day a couple of years ago. And I remember that seemed like a bit of a strange comment, because what's wrong with just tolerating our differences and we can still get along despite them? Why should someone celebrate me because of my skin color? It seemed strange to me for that. So yeah, the whole idea that we're going to celebrate our differences, by definition, that means that we're celebrating tribalism.
Right, and for me personally, it's become more and more aggravating. You know, I am Jewish, but I don't consider I consider Judaism to be a faith, not a race. And people are, I had a person on about a month and a half ago claiming that Jews cannot be white because they have to be people of color. And eventually I started to realize he wasn't speaking due to genetic markers, which, there are markers that say Jews are, they tend to have certain genes that are common to the Middle East as opposed to Europe. He was more making it as a result of claiming that if you're an oppressed person, if you're a person who is being discriminated against, then therefore you automatically are a person of color, which I found to be, ridiculous, frankly. Do you think, this is kind of a hot topic today, but do you think that there is a demonization of certain populations now that as a result of this desire to rectify the sins of the past, if I may call it that?
Oh, definitely. I think when we just look at the language that's used, I personally found that phrase "person of color" to be ridiculous, because we all have colors. It's just a matter what the color is. So my view is like, yeah, my skin color is brown. Others it might be white. Others it might be black. So yeah, so we're all people of color. So that whole term of a colored person, I think, needs to just go by the wayside. Just talk about what color it is of the skin when it's actually relevant to do so. But most of the time, it's not going to be.
Right, and I think that unfortunately, when people can't personally attest to their own personal hardships due to class or things like that, they start to resort to this race-based rhetoric. You see a lot of people, for example, I don't know if you know the TV show The Boondocks, which is, have you heard of it?
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
So The Boondocks, if I may go off on a tangent, is a show that centers around two young black children living in a tenement, or I think they actually moved out of a tenement into suburbia, and they're basically adjusting to life as black suburban children in a racist white world. But in point of fact, the person who created it, and I think it's a brilliant cartoon, but I just don't agree with the premise of it. The person who created it never lived in any sort of slum or project or anything. He actually grew up in suburban Maryland, and he's basically made a career very successfully of these cartoons that make it seem as if America has never evolved from being a racist and bigoted culture. So looking forward, do you think that people will ever adjust to acknowledging that, certain improvements have been made to society, or do you think that unfortunately certain people are just hopeless and they must keep it alive, all these grievances, in order to have meaning in life?
Well, I think there's definitely a small group that needs to keep those differences alive, and those small groups are going to be, the extremes end of the political left and the political right. So I think that's sort of where the one thing they do have in common is there. It's mostly from here, what is the majority going to say? Well, are they going to allow that to continue? So, yeah, I guess as long as the majority of people continue to stay silent, then we're going to continue on the path that we're on right now.
Right, and I think hearing your story, I work in a place, thank God people are pretty nice. And I think it's fortunate that in engineering and in the technical fields, it's not as restrictive of a climate as what I've seen from your case and from Dr. Weinstein's case and from Ms. Shepard's case. But I see this infecting our society as well. In fact, I have, the director of engineering technology who sits right next to me. He happens to be a Puerto Rican gentleman, but he said to me that he notices this type of behavior because he's going to school to finish his bachelor's degree, which is, so he's, people who are older, who are in academia now, or who are pursuing degrees now, they're seeing this, and it's almost like they are getting, a cold bath suddenly. So I believe we're almost at an hour and 10 minutes, and I don't want to keep you too long. With your final word, I mean, what do you think is the outlook for yourself in terms of trying to find yourself in a world where basically, society has become more and more judgmental and bitter, and it just pursues people that seem to, buck the trend?
Well, hoping that somehow I can be in a position where, if I had a higher profile, where I could at least try to help give people advice, especially if they're academics and they're in that position, what they can at least do to navigate to a best possible outcome if they want to speak out within academia. That would be something I'd like to do, somehow be an advocate for those who can't speak for themselves. So, and yeah, maybe if there is others who'd want to reach out to me just so that their story is told with sufficient details removed so that their names could be anonymous, but at least the gist of their story comes across. That's what I'd like to somehow be able to do in the future. So in the short term, I just want to get my own personal affairs in order, just take some time to rebuild myself after the last couple of years. But yeah, if there's ways I can somehow help others who are struggling or who can't speak for themselves, that would definitely be something I'd like to do.
Right, and obviously, if there's anything I can do to help, I mean, I'm trying to get stories like this out, but we all feel for you. I lost my job last year, but not for freedom of speech. But I think that it's worse when you're this type of thing becomes the source of news stories, and you probably have had certain remarks thrown your way on the internet regarding what happened to you. Have you received, I know it's not necessary to highlight this, but do people sort of attack you from the internet now concerning what happened?
Not so much anymore. I think for them, they got what they wanted, which was that I'm not in academia. So for the most part, I don't hear too much from them. I think probably what hurt most was, when it's former students who suddenly unfriend you on Facebook, and especially when it's people who've known you for years or ones that you might have even helped personally. So I think that's what I found the most disheartening. It was probably, it's that people who you've known and trusted, and when they turn their back on you. But the way I see it is that's what they did to Jesus too, with his own disciples, turning against him. So yeah, when you put it in perspective and see how much worse, he went through for us as human beings, I find that helps give some perspective and gives me that reality check to try to stay grounded. Because especially when a world feels like everything's topsy-turvy, I found the Bible been a nice way of saying this is my moral compass, and that's been wonderful as a guide. So that's
an interesting thing, and I know we're about to wrap up, but were you coming close to religion prior to this episode? Did you grow up religious, or is this something that's developed as a result of the issues that you've gone through with Acadia?
I think it's as a result of. So before, I think where I probably got most of my religion would have been from movies. So being a big fan of the Dark Knight trilogy as an example, or superhero films, and so I'd looked up to them and try to see what made them virtuous, and that's who I try to sort of emulate. And so I think all that's happened is I've gone from the archetypes that are inspired by the Bible to the real deal.
Yeah, I think that's like a strange thing. I mean, maybe one day, I mean, on your channel, I don't know if you want to address it, but I find the same issue because I grew up, my personally, my mom was very, I'd say she was agnostic, and my dad, they were divorced, so my dad was sort of like religious, Jewish religious, and I would read especially things like F. Scott Fitzgerald and some of the more nihilistic modern literature, but I'd also read through the Bible, and I've kind of you know I don't know, I've had like a more cynical approach to faith, even though I do believe in God, and of course the redeeming characteristics of practicing religion. But I think that when you're going through issues where people are basically turning their back on you, I would have said that the issue, Joseph being sold into slavery would have been an appropriate metaphor. But it's been great. Would you like a last word before we go?
Well, definitely grateful for being on this podcast and for the questions that have come in. It'd be definitely great to talk about other issues. So some of the ones like religion, sort of from the beginner's perspective, because this is definitely all new to me. So it'd be nice actually to have input from other uh, listeners or viewers who'd be putting in their thoughts, because that's definitely, I think, part of the next chapter of my life will probably be focusing a bit more on the spiritual journey. But yeah, I'm definitely hoping to talk to anyone about any topics as long as we're communicating in good faith.
Right, and before we go, I'll acknowledge all of the people first of all, I think I'll put the link to your channel. Your channel is the Rick Mehta channel, right?
Yep.
So I'll put that in the chat real quick, and then I'll acknowledge the people in the audience because some of them joined a little later.
Yeah, definitely grateful for them to spend their time listening to me.
Yeah, I think that most people around the world can relate. We have, for example, my friend Arjun, who I alluded to him earlier, who's he's grown up in India. He's talked a little bit in bewilderment about some of the issues here in the U.S. because in India it's not exactly the same. They do have issues with political correctness. So I want to thank Arjun, Just My Stupid Opinion, Larry Gerke, DI Freighter Watcher, Metadata Man. I think that's about it. Thanks for tuning in and have a great evening.
Thank you.
All right, good night.